"Don't look at my fat body," she whispered, beaten and barefoot in the dirt of a cold frontier street. The crowd laughed. The sheriff turned his head. But from the shadows, a mountain man stepped forward. He wrapped her in his coat, carried her from the jeers, and set himself against the whole town. What he didn't know, this broken widow carried more than bruises. She held the deed to a spring that could change the future of the railroad, the sheriff, and every family in the valley. Now, with a price on her head and her shame turned into a weapon, the mountain man must decide, will he risk his land, his life, and his soul for the woman no one else would protect? Or will her whispered words become her final prayer? When the law is bought and the snow is falling, who dares to stand for mercy? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter wind howled through the darkened streets, carrying the sharp scent of whiskey and tobacco from the saloon's swinging doors. Eliza Mayfield lay crumpled in the mud, her chest heaving with silent sobs as cruel laughter echoed around her. The rough hands that had dragged her outside still burned against her skin, leaving angry red marks that would soon turn to bruises. Look at her wallowing like a stuck pig. One man shouted, his words slurred and mean. Others joined in, their boot heels splashing dirty water onto her torn dress. Eliza pressed her face into the cold earth, willing herself to disappear. "Don't look at my fat body," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But her quiet plea only fueled their mockery. The crowd pressed closer, their shadows stretching long and dark in the yellow lamplight. "Reckon she ain't paid her husband's debts with more than tears." Another voice sneered. The words cut deeper than the chill air, reminding her of all she'd lost: her Thomas, their little home, and now her dignity. Then suddenly, the laughter stopped. Heavy boots crunched through the mud, and a hush fell over the crowd. Eliza felt something warm and heavy settle over her shoulders, a coat that smelled of pine smoke and leather. Strong arms slipped beneath her, gentle despite their obvious power, and lifted her from the muck as easily as if she were made of cotton and air-dot through tear-blurred eyes. She saw her rescuer's face weathered and scarred, with eyes that held both steel and kindness. James Boone, she knew him by reputation only, the mountain man who kept to himself, trading furs in town, but never lingering longer than necessary. Now he cradled her against his chest, shielding her from the crowd's stares. "Show's over," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made the drunken men step back. Some muttered under their breath, others spat in the dirt. But none dared challenge him. James carried her across the street to the livery stable, the warmth of his body seeping through the coat and into her chilled bones. The stable's large wooden doors creaked as he shouldered them open, and the familiar scent of hay and horses wrapped around them like a comfort from her. Childhood, he set her down carefully on a fresh pile of straw, making sure his coat stayed wrapped around her shoulders. The lantern he lit cast soft shadows on the rough-hewn walls. And somewhere in the darkness, a horse nickered softly. Eliza's body shook from cold, from fear, from shame. She couldn't stop trembling, couldn't find words to speak. James moved with quiet efficiency, bringing her a tin cup of fresh water from the pump and a chunk of bread from his own provisions. "Thank you," she managed finally, her voice rough. "I'm Eliza Mayfield." James nodded, settling himself on a nearby bale of hay, close enough to offer protection, but far enough to give her space. "James Boone," he replied simply. The water tasted sweet and clean, washing away the bitter taste of humiliation. As she sipped, James kept watch, his presence steady and reassuring. He didn't stare at her like the others had, didn't judge her body or her circumstances. His respect was a tangible thing, as real as the coat around her shoulders. "They came for Thomas's debts," she explained, though he hadn't asked. "Said I had to pay what he owed. But I can't. I don't." Fresh tears threatened, but she forced them back. "Ain't right," James said, his voice low and firm. "Man passes, his debts should pass too." The simple justice in his words made her chest ache. Thomas hadn't been a bad husband, just unlucky in his ventures, always chasing the next big strike that never came. Now she was left alone, carrying the weight of his failures along with her own shame. The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stable walls. Outside, the wind continued to moan, but here, in this humble shelter, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Safety. This quiet mountain man with his scarred face and gentle hands had given her more than just rescue from the mud. He'd given her dignity. She pulled his coat tighter around herself, breathing in its scent of freedom and wild places. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Boone, and there's no need for thanks. Rest now. Morning comes soon enough." In the growing quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of sleeping horses and winter wind, Eliza felt her trembling slowly ease. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment of mercy would stay with her, a reminder that even in the darkest times, God could send an unexpected angel, even one wearing a buckskin jacket and carrying the scars of his own painful past. Dawn crept through the weathered cracks of the livery stable, painting thin stripes of pale light across the hay-strewn floor. James sat quietly on his wooden crate, watching as Eliza gathered her courage to speak. Her eyes were red and swollen from a night of fitful sleep. But there was something stronger beneath her pain, a quiet dignity that even the mud couldn't hide. "Thomas, my husband, he passed last spring," she began, her voice trembling like an aspen leaf in the wind. "The fever took him so quick we barely had time to say goodbye." She twisted the worn fabric of her skirt between her fingers. He always believed the next claim would be the one, always chasing that dream of striking it rich. James listened, his scarred face impassive, but his eyes gentle. The morning light revealed fresh bruises on her arms, dark against her pale skin. Choking back a sob, they came saying Thomas owed them money for supplies and stakes in mining claims. Said they had papers proving they owned our land now. Her shoulders shook. "When I told them I hadn't seen any such papers, they couldn't finish the sentence." "Best get those hurts looked at," James said softly. He stood and offered his hand. "Preacher's wife tends to folks at the clinic. She's got a gentle touch." Eliza nodded, wincing as she tried to stand. James steadied her with careful hands, and together they made their slow way down the dusty street. The town was just starting to wake, storekeepers sweeping their wooden sidewalks. The smell of morning bread wafting from the bakery, they didn't go unnoticed. Outside the general store, two men paused their work to stare. That mountain man don't meddle unless there's something in it. One muttered to the other, loud enough to carry Dot. James kept his eyes forward, but his jaw tightened. He'd heard such whispers before, civilization's distrust of those who preferred the company of mountains to men. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting Eliza proper care. The clinic was a small, whitewashed building near the church. Inside, Martha Webb, the preacher's wife, took one look at Eliza and quickly ushered her behind a screen. James waited in the front room, his hat in his hands, until Martha assured him Eliza would be well-tended later that morning. As James crossed the street from the general store where he'd bought supplies, Sheriff Clay Harlan stepped into his path. The lawman's badge gleamed dully on his chest, but his eyes were cold as river stones. "Quite the hero this morning, Boone," Harlan said, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "But you can't keep her. She's trouble, and worse, she's got something men with power want." James met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "What might that be?" Harlan's mouth twisted in an ugly smile. "That ain't your concern. Best leave town business to townfolk." He adjusted his gun belt meaningfully. "Unless you're aiming to trade your mountain freedom for a jail cell." James said nothing, but his silence carried weight. Harlan spat in the dirt and walked away, his spurs jingling with each step. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple, when James returned to the clinic. Eliza sat in a clean dress borrowed from Martha Webb, her hair neatly combed, but her eyes still carried shadows of fear. James set a fresh loaf of bread on the table beside her. "You're safe here for the night," he said quietly. "Martha's good people. Won't let no harm come to you." Eliza looked up at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you, James. I don't know why you're helping me." But she trailed off, unable to find words for her gratitude. James nodded once, understanding in his silence. The clinic's window caught the last rays of sunlight, turning the glass to fire. Outside, the town settled into evening, unaware of the currents of power and greed swirling beneath its surface. Whatever Eliza had that powerful men wanted, James reckoned it was worth more than just mining debts. But for now, she needed rest and safety. Tomorrow's troubles would come soon enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as James waited outside the clinic. Elisa emerged, wearing the same borrowed dress from yesterday, but standing straighter now, despite her lingering bruises. She tried to thank Martha Webb again, but the preacher's wife simply pressed a small bundle of healing herbs into her hands with a kind smile. "There's a decent boarding house 2 streets over," James said, offering his arm for support. "Clean rooms, quiet folks." Eliza shook her head. "I can't afford, already settled it," James interrupted gently. "Paid for 2 weeks." "Mr. Boone, I can't accept James," he corrected. "And you can—" "The way I see it, folks help folks out here. That's all there is to it." The boarding house was a 2-story building with white curtains in the windows and geraniums struggling to bloom in wooden boxes. Inside, the parlor smelled of pine, soap, and coffee. The proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, showed them to a small but tidy room overlooking the street. Later, they sat in the parlor with cups of weak tea. The room was empty except for them, and Eliza's hands trembled as she set her cup down. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, "about why those men really want our land." She glanced around before continuing. "Thomas, he wasn't just mining. Before he died, he filed a claim on a spring up in the high country. Pure, year-round water." Her voice dropped even lower. "The railroad needs that water for their steam engines. Without it, they can't push their line through the pass." James sat very still, understanding dawning in his eyes. Water rights in the high country were worth more than any gold strike. No wonder the railroad's men were willing to break her. "Sheriff Harlan," he said carefully. "Best not trust him. He wears that badge, but it ain't justice he serves." Eliza nodded, her face pale. "I've seen him taking money from men in fancy suits. Railroad men, I expect." They walked slowly back through town, James shortening his stride to match her pace. Whispers followed them like shadows. Outside the mercantile, 2 women stopped their sweeping to stare. Near the post office, a group of men fell silent as they passed. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil drew them to the blacksmith shop. Old Tom Murphy worked alone, his leather apron dark with sweat. His weathered face brightened at the sight of James. "Been too long in them mountains," friend Tom said, setting down his hammer. His eyes flickered curiously to Eliza, but he asked no questions, while Eliza examined a display of copper pots hanging near the door. James spoke quietly with his old friend. "Railroad's been through here," Tom muttered, pretending to examine a horseshoe. "Buying up every spring and creek within 20 miles. Offering good money, too, but those that won't sell." He shrugged meaningfully. "Find themselves in trouble," James finished. "Heard tell they got men watching the passes," Tom added, making sure nobody stakes new claims on water rights. The sun was setting when James returned to the boarding house. He found Eliza in the parlor, alone by the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows on her face, making her look both stronger and more vulnerable. "I have no one left," she said without preamble. "No family, no children. Thomas and I," she swallowed hard. "We tried, but it wasn't God's plan for us." Her hands twisted in her lap. "All I have is that deed, hidden where they won't find it. Thomas believed that spring could give us a future. Now it feels more like a curse." James settled into the chair opposite her. The fire popped and sparked, sending up a shower of embers. "Ain't right?" he said finally. "What they're doing? Man works honest for something, signs his name legal and proper. That ought to mean something." He met her eyes steadily. "I aim to stand with you on this." Eliza stared at him, surprise and something like hope flickering across her face. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" "Because it's right," he said simply. "And out here, that's got to count for something. Or none of us has got anything at all." The fire crackled between them, and outside the window, the last light faded from the mountains. In the growing darkness, the people who had been alone for so long found something neither had expected, an ally in a fight that was only beginning. Dawn painted the mountains gold as James stepped out of the livery stable. Adjusting the cinch on his saddle, the crisp morning air carried wood smoke from breakfast fires and the distant whistle of the morning train. He'd barely taken 3 steps toward the boarding house when heavy boots scuffed the dirt behind. "Him Boone," Sheriff Harlan's voice cut through the morning quiet. "Got business with you?" James turned slowly. The sheriff stood in the middle of the street, flanked by deputies Miller and Watson. Their badges gleamed dully in the early light. "Ain't got any business with you." "Sheriff," James replied, his voice level. Harlan's face darkened. "That widow you're harboring, hand her over. She's wanted for questioning about some missing property." "Missing property?" James's tone held quiet steel. "Seems to me the only thing missing is honest law in this town." The sheriff's hand drifted toward his revolver. His deputies spread out slightly, their own fingers twitching near their gun belts. The few townspeople on the street hurried inside, doors clicking shut behind them. "Now listen here, mountain man," Harlan growled. "That woman's got something doesn't belong to her. Best you step aside before you get hurt." James didn't move. "She's under my protection. That deed's hers, legal and proper." Tension crackled like static before a storm. James kept his hands loose at his sides, but his eyes never left the sheriff's trigger finger. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, Harlan's hand dropped away from his gun. A cold smile crossed his face. "You'll regret this, Boone, mark my words." He jerked his head at his deputies. And they backed away, boots scraping in the dirt. James watched them go, then headed straight to the general store. He knew they couldn't stay in town now. The clerk's eyes darted nervously as James bought supplies: flour, coffee, dried beef, matches. He added warm socks and a heavy shawl for Eliza. Outside, he purchased a sturdy mule from the livery stable to carry their provisions. All day, James felt eyes watching the boarding house. As sunset approached and shadows lengthened across the street, he slipped around to the back door. Eliza was waiting, clutching a small bundle of belongings. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, though fear showed plain on her face. Her feet were wrapped in borrowed boots. Too large, but better than nothing against the mountain cold. They led the horses through the back alley, keeping to the shadows until they reached the trail heading up into the hills. The winter sky spread vast and clear above them, stars beginning to pierce the darkening blue. James helped Eliza mount, then swung up onto his own horse. The trail wound higher into the mountains, through stands of towering pines. The air grew sharper with altitude, and James heard Eliza's breath coming harder. He slowed their pace, watching how she hunched against the cold. "Need to rest?" he asked after an hour. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice shook. James led them off the main trail to a sheltered hollow he knew well. Tall pines created a natural windbreak, and a small stream gurgled nearby under a thin crust of ice. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, helping her down. Her borrowed boots had rubbed blisters. He could see her wince as she stood. While Eliza huddled in her shawl, James efficiently set up camp. He gathered dry wood, built a fire, and spread blankets near its warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the pine boughs above them. "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered as James handed her a cup of hot coffee. "I never meant to bring such trouble to your door. I'll only be a burden to you up here." James settled on his heels beside the fire, studying the flames. "My PA used to say burdens are meant to be carried together," he said gruffly. "Otherwise, they break a person." He looked up at her. "You ain't no burden, Miss Eliza. You're just somebody needing help, same as anyone might." Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she didn't speak. James spread his bedroll near the fire and helped her arrange a comfortable spot against the saddle. As she drifted to sleep, soft white flakes began drifting down through the pine branches. The snow fell silently, covering their tracks below, while James kept watch through the night, his rifle across his knees. Morning light crept over the mountain peaks as James and Eliza made their final ascent. The trail narrowed between ancient pines, their branches heavy with fresh snow. James led the way, his horse picking carefully through the drifts, while Eliza followed on her borrowed mount, the pack mule bringing up the rear dot around a bend in the trail. James's cabin came into view. Built of sturdy logs cut from the surrounding forest, it stood proudly against the wilderness. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, rising straight up in the still mountain air. A frozen creek wound past the cabin's western edge. Helping Eliza down from her horse, her legs trembled from the long ride, but her eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the peaceful scene. James led her to the cabin door, brushing snow from his boots before stepping inside. The interior was simple but well kept. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, radiating welcome warmth. Stacked firewood lined one wall, while heavy furs draped across a wooden bed frame in the corner. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood beneath a small window, and shelves held basic provisions and cooking supplies. "It ain't much," James said. Suddenly self-conscious of his bachelor accommodations, Eliza moved slowly through the space, touching the smooth-worn table edge. "It's wonderful," she whispered. "So peaceful up here." She stood at the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of snow-covered peaks. "I've never heard such silence." After settling the horses in the lean-to shelter, James showed Eliza around the cabin's workings. "Creek stays open here," he explained, leading her to a spot where Swiftwater had carved a hole in the ice. "Best water you'll ever taste." Eliza tried to help with the morning chores, but her hands shook with exhaustion. When she stumbled, trying to carry firewood, James steadied her with gentle hands. "No rush," he said. "Rest first. I'll show you how to split kindling when you're stronger." He demonstrated the technique anyway, letting her watch as he expertly reduced a log to neat sticks. As the day passed, Eliza's color improved in the mountain air. James showed her how to work the heavy iron pump that drew water from the creek, supporting her arms as she learned its rhythm. Though she tired quickly, determination showed in her face. When evening approached, Eliza insisted on preparing supper. "Please," she said, "let me do this small thing." Her hands might tremble. Soon, savory smells filled the cabin. She had managed a simple stew with dried beef and the vegetables they had brought from town. They sat across from each other at the table, lamplight casting warm shadows on the log walls. James couldn't remember the last time he had shared a meal with anyone. The silence felt different now, filled with the quiet sounds of spoons against bowls and the crackling stove. "I'm sorry, it's not better," Eliza said softly, watching him eat. "My hands are still clumsy with fatigue." James looked up, meeting her worried gaze. "You belong here," he said simply, the words coming straight from his heart. "The food's good. Everything's good." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, ducking her head to hide her emotion. Later, as darkness settled over the mountains, a storm began to rise. Wind moaned through the pines, and snow pelted against the windows. James moved through the cabin, checking the heavy wooden shutters, adding wood to the stove, and making sure all was secure. When he finished his rounds, he found Eliza kneeling beside the fire, her head bowed in prayer. Firelight played across her face, highlighting tracks of tears on her cheeks. "Dear Lord," she whispered, unaware of his presence, "why have you spared me so many times? What purpose do you have for someone like me?" Her voice broke. "Thank you for sending James. Please help me be worthy of his kindness." James stood motionless in the shadows, his heart heavy with emotion he dared not show. Her faith touched something deep within him, something he had thought long buried in his solitary years on the mountain. Though he kept his thoughts hidden, watching her pray stirred memories of his own mother kneeling by his bedside, teaching him about God's mercy. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin, peace settled like a warm blanket. Eliza's prayers mingled with the crackling fire, while James stood guard in the darkness, protecting this fragile moment of grace that had somehow found its way to his mountain home. The storm settled in like a wild beast, howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shutters. For 2 days, thick snow fell in endless sheets, transforming the mountain into a white fortress. Inside, James and Eliza found comfort in simple tasks that kept their hands busy and their minds occupied. "Here," James said, spreading his old buckskin coat across the table. A long tear marred one sleeve where he'd caught it on a branch. "Might as well learn something useful while we wait out the weather." Elisa's fingers trembled slightly as she threaded the bone needle, but her stitches were neat and strong. James watched her work, noting how she bent close to see in the dim light, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My sister used to mend like that," he said quietly, the words surprising him. He rarely spoke of Sarah. She'd sit by the window, humming hymns while she worked. Eliza's hands stilled. What happened to her? Fever took her. She was just 16. James stared into the fire. "I was supposed to be watching her that day, but I went hunting instead." By the time I got back, he fell silent, the old guilt heavy in his chest. "It wasn't your fault," Eliza said softly. "Sickness comes when it will." Later that afternoon, James taught her to whittle trap stakes, showing her how to hold the knife safely and work with the grain of the wood. As they worked, Eliza spoke of her own past. "I married Thomas because our families arranged it," she explained, carefully shaving a thin curl of pine. "He was kind enough, but there was never any real love between us, just duty and trying to make the best of things." She sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if that's all I deserve." "You deserve more than duty," James said gruffly, surprising them both with his directness. The storm finally broke on the third morning. James opened the cabin door to find the world transformed, gleaming white and pristine beneath a crystal-clear sky. After breakfast, he helped Elisa bundle up in warm layers. "Want to show you something?" he said, leading her up a narrow trail that wound through deep snow to a high ridge. When they reached the top, Eliza gasped. Below them stretched the entire valley, a magnificent canvas of white and blue. Snow-capped peaks marched to the horizon like silent giants, their faces catching the morning sun. Frozen rivers wound through the landscape like silver ribbons, and vast forests of pine created dark patterns against the snow. "Oh," Eliza breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "I never knew the world could look like this." James watched her face as she took in the view, noting how she stood straighter, more confident in her borrowed boots and warm clothes. When she turned to thank him, their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't look away in shame. That evening, Eliza insisted on preparing supper herself. "I found venison in your storehouse," she said, "already at work with vegetables and herbs. Please, let me do this." The stew filled the cabin with rich aromas as it simmered. James sat at the table, whittling another steak while he watched her move about the kitchen with growing assurance. When she finally served the meal, the meat was tender and perfectly seasoned. "This is real fine cooking," James said, meaning every word. "Best meal I've had in years." A faint smile touched Eliza's lips, and color rose in her cheeks. "Thank you," she said quietly, but pride showed in her eyes. After the dishes were cleared, James retrieved a bundle wrapped in soft deer hide from beneath his bed. He'd been saving these, though he wasn't sure why until now. "Got something for you," he said, holding out the package. "Traded for these a while back. Reckon they'll fit better than those borrowed boots." Eliza unwrapped the bundle, too. Reveal a pair of beautifully beaded moccasins, the leather supple and dark with age. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns reverently. "They're beautiful," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. Try them on," James suggested gruffly, touched by her emotion. The moccasins fit perfectly. Eliza walked a few steps, marveling at their comfort. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with feeling. That night seemed different from the others. The wind had gentled to a soft whisper through the pines, and the fire cast warm shadows on the log walls. James added wood to the stove, while Eliza sat in her chair by the hearth, still wearing her new moccasins. The wilderness that had seemed so harsh just days ago now felt like a protective presence, wrapping the cabin in peaceful silence. Something had shifted between them, as delicate and real as the first green shoots of spring beneath the snow. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the change as they prepared for sleep. Moving around each other in the small space with growing ease and trust, James studied the morning sky, gauging the weather. "Need to ride down for supplies," he said over breakfast. "Think you can manage here?" Eliza nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "What should I do?" "Keep the fire steady," he explained, showing her how to arrange the logs in the stove. "And mind the stew pot. There's venison and beans for your dinner." He demonstrated the proper height for the flames, then gathered his coat and saddlebags. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, mounting his horse. The animal's hooves crunched in the fresh snow as they disappeared down the trail. Leaving Eliza alone in the vast quiet of the mountains, she set about her tasks with determination. Though her hands shook slightly as she added wood to the stove, the fire dwindled twice, and she had to restart it using the techniques James had taught her. Each time, she felt a small surge of pride when the flames caught and grew strong again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows. When Eliza heard voices outside, her heart jumped into her throat. Approaching the door were 3 figures of a Navajo family wrapped in warm blankets, leading a pack horse laden with pelts. The older woman in front smiled broadly and raised her hand in greeting. "Hello, James's friend," she called out in clear English. Eliza opened the door slowly, her voice timid. "Yes, I'm Elisa." James rode down to town. "I am Nayland," the woman said, her eyes kind and knowing. "We trade with James many seasons now. These are my son and grandson." The 2 men nodded respectfully. Maintaining a polite distance, Eliza invited them inside, remembering her manners despite her nervousness. Nayland moved with the easy confidence of someone familiar with the cabin. Setting her bundle on the table, "Ah, you tend the fire well," Nayland observed, warming her hands by the stove. She reached into her shawl and brought out a small leather pouch. Here dried berries from summer, good medicine for the spirit. The berries were sweet tart, unlike anything Eliza had tasted before. As they shared the treat, Nayland spoke of the mountains which plants could heal, where springs ran even in winter, how to read weather in the clouds. She provides, Nayland said, gesturing to the window. But you must learn her ways. Listen more than speak. Watch more than walk. She smiled at Eliza. James knows this. That's why he lives high, away from town trouble. Eliza found herself relaxing in Nayland's presence. The older woman's quiet strength reminded her of her grandmother. Long past, they talked as the men sorted pelts outside. Nayland sharing stories of raising children in the high country, of surviving hard winters through community and faith. The sun was lowering when James returned, his saddlebags full. He paused in the doorway, taking in the Senaliza and Nayland seated by the fire. The cabin warm with conversation and the smell of brewing tea. Yeah, James Nayland called out cheerfully. Your friend has good manners and a willing heart. James's usual stern expression softened. Stay for supper, he asked, and Nolan's eyes crinkled with pleasure. The evening meal was simple stew and cornbread, but the cabin had never felt so alive. Nayland's grandson told funny stories about learning to hunt, while her son spoke quietly with James about trading roots. Eliza served everyone seconds, her movements more confident now. Laughter rose easily, warming the space like summer sunshine. Eliza felt something heavy and dark lifting from her shoulders. Here, no one stared at her size or whispered cruel words. She was simply herself, woman among friends, sharing food and stories. James watched her from across the table, noting how she glowed in the firelight. Her eyes were bright, her smile quick and natural. She looked younger somehow, unburdened by shame and fear. The Navajo family left as the first stars appeared, promising to visit again soon. Nayland hugged Eliza tightly, whispering something that made her blush and smile. As Eliza prepared for sleep that night, she turned to James. Thank you, she said softly, for trusting me with them. I was scared at first, being alone when they came, but she paused. Searching for words, James hung his coat by the door, his voice gruff but gentle. They're not strangers, he said simply. They're family. Eliza stood quiet for a moment, letting those words sink in. Family. How long had it been since she'd known what that meant? Here in the mountains, far from the town's cruel judgment, she was finding out. December brought deeper snows to the high country, blanketing the cabin in pristine white. The morning air grew sharp as a knife's edge, and frost painted delicate patterns across the window panes. James knew they needed to prepare for winter's harshest months ahead. We'll need more wood, he told Eliza over breakfast one morning, and meat to smoke. Winter's just beginning. Eliza set down her cup with determination. I want to help. Show me what to do. Together they ventured into the snow-laden forest. James demonstrated how to identify the best trees for cutting dead standing pines that would burn hot and long. Eliza insisted on helping, despite her breath coming quick and heavy in the thin mountain air. Rest when you need to, James said, but she shook her head. I can carry my share, she replied, lifting smaller logs with stubborn pride. Though she tired quickly, she refused to return to the cabin until they had a proper stack of wood. Days fell into a rhythm. James checked his trap lines, while Eliza learned to smoke venison. Hanging strips of meat in the small smokehouse behind the cabin, her hands grew stronger, more certain with each task. When she stumbled or dropped things, James never criticized. He simply showed her again, his patience as steady as the mountains themselves. One evening, Eliza returned from gathering kindling to find James working late in his tool shed. He quickly shooed her away, saying gruffly, Got something that needs finishing. No peeking. The next morning, she discovered a rocking chair beside the stove, built from sturdy pine and polished smooth. Elisa ran her fingers over the curved arms, noting how the joints fit together perfectly. It creaks a little, she said softly. Settling into it, James nodded, a rare smile touching his eyes. Wood's meant to creak. That means it's strong enough to hold weight. He paused, watching her test the gentle motion. Strong things don't break easy. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she understood his meaning. She brushed them away quickly, but her voice was thick with emotion. Thank you, James. As Christmas Eve approached, the cabin filled with simple preparations. Eliza baked cornbread and simmered dried berries into sauce, while James brought in fresh pine boughs to decorate the walls. When Naylin and her family arrived that evening, they brought traditional fry bread and stories to share. The cabin glowed with lamplight and fellowship. After the meal, Naylin suggested they sing hymns. James surprised everyone by producing a battered hymnal from his trunk. It was my sister's, he explained quietly to Elisa. She loved Christmas. Songs Elisa knew what it cost him to share this piece of his past. When Naylin began Silent Night, Eliza joined in, her voice trembling at first. Though she hadn't sung since her husband died, the familiar words came back easily. James watched her, something soft and wondering in his expression. They sang several more hymns, their voices blending in the warm air. Naylin's grandson played a wooden flute, its sweet notes weaving through the melody. Even James hummed quietly, though he claimed he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. After their guests departed, James and Eliza sat in comfortable silence. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. James rose to add another log, and as he settled it onto the coals, his hand brushed Eliza's where she sat in her rocking chair. Neither pulled away. The touch lingered, gentle as snowfall. Eliza's heart fluttered as James slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. In them, she saw the same loneliness that had haunted her own heart, and the same hope of healing. James straightened, still holding her hand. With infinite tenderness, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, hesitant to question more than a demand. Eliza answered by reaching up to touch his scarred cheek, accepting this gift of trust between them. When they parted, James rested his forehead against hers for a moment. No words were needed. The peace in the room was as deep as the snow outside, as real as the solid chair beneath her, as true as the way their hands remained clasped together for the first time since her world had shattered. Eliza felt her heart stirring with possibility. Like the wood of her rocking chair, she was stronger than she'd known. And here, in this cabin, high among the winter stars, she dared to believe she might find not just safety, but love. And not just safety, but love. The morning after Christmas dawned clear and cold. Fresh snow draped the evergreens like lace, and icicles sparkled from the cabin's eaves. James pulled on his heavy coat and checked his rifle. "I need to run my trap lines," he told Eliza. "Should be back before sundown." Eliza nodded from her rocking chair, where she was already at work mending one of his shirts. "I'll keep the fire going." Her fingers moved steadily with the needle. More confident now after weeks of practice, James paused at the door, watching her work in the morning light. The kiss they had shared still lingered in his mind, warm as embers. With a gruff nod, he shouldered his gear and headed out into the crystal air. After he left, Eliza hummed Christmas hymns while she worked. The peaceful morning stretched on as she finished the mending and swept the rough wooden floors. Near midday, she was just adding wood to the stove when heavy boots thundered on the porch. Before she could move, the door burst open. 3 men in railroad company coats rushed inside. Eliza tried to scream, but a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She recognized Silas Mercer's cold smile as he stepped through the doorway. "Where's the deed, Mrs. Mayfield?" Mercer's voice was silk over steel. When Eliza struggled, he nodded to his men. "Search everything." They tore through the cabin, ripping open James's trunk, scattering furs and supplies. Elisa fought against the arms holding her, but they were too strong. Tears froze on her cheeks as they dragged her outside into the bitter cold. "Looks like your mountain man isn't here too." "Save you this time," one man sneered, shoving her toward their horses. They hadn't even let her grab her coat or boots. The long trek down the mountain was torture. Her stocking feet went numb in the snow as they forced her to walk between their horses. Every time she stumbled, they yanked her roughly upright, laughing at her size and clumsy steps. "Too heavy to carry, boys," one called out, earning cruel chuckles. "Make her walk." Mercer rode ahead, his back straight with satisfaction. As they descended, he ordered 2 men to return to the cabin. Eliza's heart clenched when she saw smoke rising behind them shortly after. Her sanctuary was burning. The winter sun was setting by the time they reached town. Mercer paraded her down the muddy main street, past the same saloon where James had first rescued her. History repeated itself as townspeople gathered to stare. "Look what we caught in the mountains," Mercer announced. shoving her into a puddle. The mountain man's woman, trying to cheat the railroad, Eliza's dress was soaked and muddy, her feet bleeding from the frozen ground. But she kept her chin up, remembering James's words about strength. Inside, though, her heart was breaking. Would he find her in time? Miles above, James returned to devastation. His cabin, their home, was a smoking ruin in the snow. The roof had collapsed, and flames still licked at the logs. Everything they had built together was destroyed. Fear and fury warred in his chest as he searched for signs of Eliza. Finding none, he examined the tracks leading away from the cabin. Multiple horses, heading toward town. His hands shook as he pictured Eliza being dragged through the snow. Suffering alone, James checked his rifle and ammunition with trembling fingers. The same men who had humiliated her before had dared to touch her again, had burned his home. The quiet mountain man felt something dark and dangerous rising in his heart. He mounted his horse, urging it down the snowy trail. The tracks were clear in the fresh powder. He could follow them easily. But would he reach town in time? The thought of Eliza enduring their cruelty again made him sick with worry and rage. The winter twilight deepened around him as he rode, pushing his horse as fast as he dared on the treacherous path. Above the trees, smoke from his ruined cabin still stained the cold sky. But James barely noticed, his thoughts fixed on reaching Eliza. Every moment of delay was another moment she suffered alone. His heart felt like it would shatter, imagining her fear and pain. The bond between them, so carefully built over these months, gave him strength even as it tormented him with worry. The lights of town began to glimmer in the valley below. James urged his horse faster, praying he wasn't too late. The same streets where he had first found her now beckoned him again, promising another confrontation with the men who thought they could break her spirit. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't just rescue her, he would make sure they never dared touch her again. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks as James rode into town. Frost glittered on his coat, and his face was set like granite. The weight of his rifle pressed against his back, a cold comfort after the long night's ride. Few people stirred in the early morning streets, though whispers followed his passage. The jail stood at the end of Main Street, its weathered boards dark against the brightening sky. James dismounted, his boots crunching on frozen mud. Through the barred windows, he heard quiet weeping. Sheriff Harlan lounged behind his desk, cleaning his revolver with practiced motions. He barely glanced up as James entered. Figured you'd show up eventually. Where is she? James's voice was rough from the cold. The sheriff jerked his thumb toward the cells. Back there, railroad's got plans for her today. James strode past him to the holding area, his heart clenched at what he saw. Eliza huddled on a thin blanket in the corner of her cell, her dress still damp and muddy. Fresh bruises marked her arms, and she shivered despite the weak warmth from the pot-bellied stove. Eliza, he gripped the iron bars, knuckles white. She looked up, her face tear-stained. James? No, you shouldn't be here. Her voice cracked. Please, go. I cannot bear to see them ruin you too. I will not fail you. The words came fierce and low. Not again. Not like he stopped, old guilt choking him. They'll hurt you, Elisa whispered. Like they burned the cabin. Like she touched her bruised cheek. James pressed his forehead against the cold bars. Rest now. Trust in God's purpose. He turned away her soft sobs, following him out into the street. The morning sun did nothing to warm the chill in his bones. His feet carried him to the small white church at the edge of town, its spire reaching toward heaven like a plea. The sanctuary was empty, smelling of pine boards and lamp oil. James sank onto a hard wooden pew, his head bowing. Memories crashed over him, his sister Mary, barely 16, dying of fever while he was away hunting. He had promised to protect her too. Lord, he whispered hoarsely, I failed them both. Mary and now Eliza. I wasn't there when his voice broke. Show me the way, please. He already has, son. The gentle voice made James look up. Pastor Williams stood in the aisle, his kind face creased with concern. The Lord doesn't waste our pain. He redeems broken men for greater purposes. I couldn't save my sister. James's hands clenched. And now Eliza suffers because I left her alone. The pastor sat beside him. You're not that young man anymore, James. God has shaped you through loss, taught you mercy through suffering. Why else would he lead you to protect a widow in need? But how can I help her now? The railroad has the law on their side. The law of man, perhaps. Pastor Williams smiled, but not the law of God. He gives strength to the weak, James courage to the broken-hearted. They sat in silence as morning light filtered through the high windows. James felt something shift in his chest. Not peace exactly, but purpose. The weight of his past failures remained, but it no longer paralyzed him. By mid-morning, word spread through town like wildfire. The railroad men planned to force Eliza to sign away her claim that very day. Some whispered about threats made, about how she would sign or face worse than bruises. James stalked down the boardwalk toward the courthouse, his spine straight. Several townsfolk shrank from his grim expression. He had changed his trail-worn clothes for clean ones borrowed from the pastor, though he kept his rifle close. Inside the courthouse, he found the clerk's office. The young man behind the desk jumped when James approached. "I need to file as witness in the Mayfield water rights case," James said quietly, "and I want to see every document about that spring claim, sir." "I don't think every document." James's voice was steel. Now, as he studied the papers, his resolve hardened. He would face the railroad men in court, armed with truth instead of bullets. The path ahead was clear at last, not just rescuing Eliza, but standing with her for justice. A bell told the hour, and James looked up from the scattered documents. Through the window, he saw Mercer and his men striding toward the jail. The time for preparation was over. Now, he would prove that God truly did redeem broken men for greater purposes. The courthouse filled quickly as word spread through town. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above the wooden benches. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers like rustling leaves. Many had never seen a water rights dispute settled in open court. The heavy doors creaked open. 2 deputies led Eliza forward, her wrists bound with rough rope. Despite her torn dress and bruised face, she walked with quiet dignity. James stood near the front, his jaw tight as he watched her shallow breaths and trembling steps. Railroad Agent Mercer sat at the prosecutor's table, his suit immaculate, his smile sharp as a knife. Sheriff Harlan lounged against the wall behind him, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. The tension in the room thickened like storm clouds gathering. Judge Harrison, his beard streaked with gray, adjusted his spectacles. "This hearing concerns water rights to Spring Creek in the high country." His gavel struck once. "Bring forward your evidence, Mr. Mercer." The railroad agent rose smoothly, producing a leather folio. "Your Honor, I have here the deed of sale, signed by Thomas Mayfield before his death, transferring all rights to the spring to the railroad company." He spread several documents across the judge's desk with flourish. "As you can see, everything is properly notarized." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. James's hands clenched into fists as he studied Eliza's face. She remained still, watching. The judge examined the papers carefully. "These appear to be in order. Mrs. Mayfield, do you contest these documents?" "I do, Your Honor." Eliza's voice was soft but clear. She stepped forward, raising her bound hands. "My husband never signed away our spring. Those papers are forged." Sheriff Harlan pushed off the wall. "She's lying, Judge," woman's addled with grief. "Seeing conspiracies everywhere, I have proof." Eliza's fingers worked at the lining of her dress, pulling loose a carefully folded paper. The crowd leaned forward as she held it out. "This is my husband's true deed, registered with the Territory Office last spring. He sewed it into my dress himself before he died." Knowing men would try to steal our water rights, gasps echoed through the courthouse. The judge took the worn document, holding it to the light. James watched Mercer's face darken like a thundercloud. "This deed appears genuine," the judge said slowly. "The territorial seal is intact." "Impossible." Mercer slammed his hand on the table. "She's fabricated that document. It cannot be legal." The sheriff stepped forward, his spurs jingling. "That woman's been nothing but trouble since her husband died. She's lying to this court, plain and simple." "Your Honor," James's voice cut through the growing chaos. He moved to stand beside Eliza, his presence steady as mountain stone. "I will testify to Mrs. Mayfield's character and the truth of her claim." Townsfolk shouted over each other, some defending Eliza, others calling for her arrest. Mercer's face twisted with rage as he shouted accusations. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his revolver. "Order." The judge's gavel crashed down 3 times. I will have order in this court." Silence fell gradually, like snow settling after a storm. Eliza swayed slightly, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. James moved closer, offering his strength. "This matter requires careful consideration," the judge announced, gathering both sets of documents. "I will review these deeds thoroughly before making any ruling." He fixed Mercer with a stern gaze. "In the meantime, no action is to be taken regarding Spring Creek. Is that clear?" Mercer's smile was brittle. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge turned to Sheriff Harlan. "Release Mrs. Mayfield's bonds. She will remain free until this matter is settled." The sheriff stepped forward reluctantly, knife slicing through the ropes. Eliza rubbed her raw wrists, then reached for James's hand, their fingers intertwined, drawing strength from each other. They faced the crowd together. Eliza stood straighter now, unashamed of her size or her circumstances. James's quiet presence beside her spoke volumes. Some townsfolk nodded in approval, while others frowned and muttered. Mercer gathered his papers with sharp movements, his careful composure cracking. "This isn't over," he hissed as he passed them. "That spring will belong to the railroad, one way or another." But Eliza didn't flinch. She squeezed James's hand tighter, her voice steady. "The truth will stand, Mr. Mercer. God sees to that." The morning sun streamed stronger through the windows now, touching Eliza's face with golden light. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the weight of fear lifting. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. Sheriff Harlan's face flushed dark with fury. He jerked his head at his deputies, his voice cutting through the courtroom's murmurs. "Get that deed, now." 2 deputies lunged forward, boots thundering across the wooden floor. James stepped in front of Eliza, his movements swift as a mountain cat. The first deputy reached for the papers in the judge's hands, but James caught his arm, twisting it back. The second deputy drew his single-action revolver with a metallic click. "Stop this at once," Judge Harrison shouted, rising from his bench. But chaos had already erupted. James ducked under the deputy's gun arm, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed into the prosecution table, sending papers flying. The revolver clattered across the floor. James's fist connected with the deputy's jaw in a solid crack that echoed through the room. Elisa pressed herself against the courtroom wall, clutching her shawl. Railroad agent Mercer tried to circle behind her, reaching for her dress where she'd hidden the deed. "Don't touch me!" she cried out, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. To everyone's surprise, 3 townsmen rushed to her defense. Old Mr. Peterson from the general store planted himself between Eliza and Mercer. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, grabbed Mercer's coat sleeve. "You leave her be." The sheriff drew his own revolver, but before he could aim, young Tommy Fletcher, the blacksmith's apprentice, knocked his arm aside. The gun discharged into the ceiling, sending splinters raining down. Women screamed. Men shouted. The courtroom dissolved into a brawl of pushing bodies and flying fists. James fought with controlled power, his movements precise. When the first deputy struggled up for another attack, James caught him with a right hook that sent him sprawling. The second deputy tried to recover his fallen revolver, but James kicked it further away, then pinned him with a knee to the chest. Enough. The preacher's voice boomed above the chaos. Reverend Mills stood on a bench, his Bible raised high. This is God's house of justice. His law stands above man's greed and violence. The fighting slowly stilled. Men stepped back, straightening collars and wiping bloodied lips. The sheriff's deputies climbed to their feet, shamefaced at being bested by a mountain man. Order, order in this court. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like rifle shots. The next person who raises a fist will spend 30 days in jail. Silence fell. James moved back to Eliza's side, his knuckles raw but his eyes alert. She touched his arm gently, checking for injuries. The judge settled his spectacles, which had gone askew in the commotion. His voice carried stern authority. Having examined both documents, I am prepared to rule. He held up the railroad's papers. These alleged transfers show signs of forgery. The dates do not align with territorial records. Mercer started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a glare. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Mayfield's deed bears not only the territorial seal, but 3 witness signatures, including the previous circuit judge. He looked directly at Eliza, by law and by right. You are the true heir to Spring Creek and all its water rights." A cheer went up from the townspeople. Sarah Miller hugged Eliza impulsively. Old Mr. Peterson clapped James on the shoulder. "This is an outrage." Mercer sputtered, his face mottled red. "The railroad will appeal. We'll take this to a territorial court. You are welcome to try." The judge's voice was cold. "But these documents will not serve your case, and I will personally testify to the attempted theft and violence I witnessed here today." Sheriff Harlan holstered his revolver slowly, his expression dark. But with the crowd now firmly behind Eliza, he didn't dare make another move. Court is adjourned. The judge's gavel fell one final time. Eliza felt James's strong arm circle her shoulders. Together, they walked toward the courthouse doors. The crowd parted, offering smiles and words of congratulation. No one mocked her sighs or whispered cruel jokes. Instead, she saw respect in their eyes, respect for her courage, her perseverance, her dignity in the face of abuse. Outside, the winter sun bathed the street in golden light. More townspeople gathered, having heard the commotion. When Eliza appeared on James's arm, they broke into applause and cheers. "God bless you, Mrs. Mayfield," called the baker's wife. "You showed them railroad men," shouted Tommy Fletcher. Eliza's cheeks flushed, but not with shame. For the first time since her husband's death, she stood tall, proud of who she was and what she had fought to protect. James squeezed her arm gently, and she saw in his eyes the same pride she felt in her heart. The sound of their victory rang through the streets of town, drowning out the bitter curses of the railroad men and their corrupt allies. Justice had prevailed, carried forward on the strength of truth and the courage of common folk who chose to stand together against greed and cruelty. The evening sun cast long shadows across the mountain as James and Eliza made their way back to his homestead. The sweet scent of pine mixed with the bitter smell of ash as they approached what remained of his cabin. The charred timbers stood like black bones against the winter sky, a stark reminder of the railroad men's cruelty. James squeezed Eliza's hand as they surveyed the damage. The roof had collapsed entirely, and soot-stained snow filled what was once their warm haven. Yet, despite the destruction, the stone foundation remained solid beneath the ruins. "They meant to break us," James said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But we'll build it back stronger." He turned to face Eliza, his eyes reflecting the determination that had carried them through their trials. Together, Eliza nodded, fighting back tears. "Together," she echoed, gripping his calloused hand tightly. They began their work as the sun dipped behind the mountains, clearing away charred boards one by one. Each piece they moved felt like lifting away a weight of sorrow, making room for hope to grow. James showed Eliza how to sort the debris, salvaging what little could be saved and stacking ruined timber for future kindling. The crunch of snow announced visitors just before dusk. Nayland appeared through the trees, leading a small group of her family members. They carried bundles of supplies blankets, tools, and dried food. "The winter winds blow cold," Nayland said, embracing Eliza warmly. "But many hands make light work." She gestured to the supplies. "These are yours, to begin again." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks as she hugged the older woman. The simple kindness of these people, who asked nothing in return, touched her deeply. James stood quietly, but his eyes showed his gratitude. As days stretched into weeks, the new cabin took shape. James and Nayland's sons worked side by side, fitting logs with careful precision. The walls rose higher each day, stronger than before. This time, James built with 2 mind-wider windows to let in more light, a larger hearth for Eliza's cooking, and a special corner where she could place her rocking chair. Despite the bitter cold, Eliza kept busy. She prepared meals for the workers, sorted through salvaged items, and planned for spring. Near the creek, where the ground stayed warm from underground springs, she planted dried beans she had saved from their first meals together. She tucked each one into the soil with a prayer, marking new beginnings. James worked mostly in silence, as was his way, but Eliza noticed the change in him. His smiles came more freely now, especially in the quiet moments when their eyes met across the construction site. The loneliness that had haunted him for so long seemed to fade with each beam they raised. Together, the comfort of community surrounded them. Nayland taught Eliza to weave while the men worked, sharing stories and wisdom. Her grandchildren played in the snow, their laughter echoing through the trees. Each evening, they all shared meals around the campfire, their circle of warmth a testament to the family they had found in each other. Spring swept through the mountains like a gentle breath, melting the snowdrift into silver ribbons of water. The creek swelled with fresh snowmelt, its song growing stronger each day. Where bare branches had stretched against winter skies, tender green buds now reached toward the warming sun. The new cabin stood proudly against the backdrop of pine-covered slopes, its sturdy logs weathered to a rich honey color. Smoke curled from the stone chimney in lazy spirals, carrying the sweet scent of pine wood and promise. Morning light caught the fresh-cut window frames James had crafted with extra care, making them glow like amber. On the wide front porch, Eliza sat in her rocking chair, the one James had built with such tenderness. The gentle creaking of wood against wood echoed like a familiar hymn across the yard. Her hands rested peacefully in her lap, no longer worried about hiding herself from view. The morning air carried the scent of wild roses that she had planted along the cabin's foundation, their first blooms just beginning to open. James stepped out onto the porch, his boots moving quietly across the wooden planks. He knelt beside her chair, his weathered hand finding hers. His eyes, usually so guarded, held nothing but warmth as he looked up at her. "I don't see your fat body," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I see the strongest woman God ever made." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. But these were different from the tears she had shed in darker times. These sparkled with joy, with acceptance, with love finally found. One rolled down her cheek as she squeezed his hand in the yard below. Children from Nallen's family played among the spring wildflowers. Their laughter rang clear and bright, mixing with the morning birdsong and the rushing of the creek. A young girl wove fresh daisies into a crown, while her brother chased butterflies through patches of mountain sunlight. The spring that had caused so much strife now flowed freely, its waters protected and life-giving. Like the water itself, God's grace had carved new paths through their lives. Wearing away old hurts and bringing new growth, Eliza and James sat together, their clasped hands a bridge between past and future. The wilderness that had once seemed so vast and lonely now embraced them like a sanctuary. Every tree, every stone, every wild creature spoke of home. In the gentle morning light, surrounded by the love they had built together, both knew with certainty that God had led them exactly where they belonged. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.